to I May Be Wrong.
I don't know what this world is coming to,
but I don't think so. We're broadcasting from the greater Nashville area, the home of country music, beyond the borders of political correctness and identity politics. Facts and faith are our demarcations. Truth lights our path.
Here's the Barry White of Podcast Radio,
the Venerable Alfonso Ashworth.
Well, welcome to another exciting episode of I May Be Wrong, but I don't think so. Of course, I am Alfonso Ashworth. We have a great episode for you this hour. We're going to be doing a special 1 hour episode of the show today. And of course, we welcome you into the show. There's a lot happening out there. There's a lot that's going on. Of course, we want you to sit back and if you have something that you want to share, you can join me. You can chat with me on Facebook Live. If you go to my Facebook page at Al Ashworth, you can find me there. Of course, you can also join us there in terms of being able to stay in contact with what's going on in the community. There's a lot happening right now in our community in Tennessee, particularly. We just recently had a tornado come through my community, through Nashville, through Middle Tennessee, through East Tennessee. There are still 88 people missing in Putnam County. And we want you to know that we have you in our prayers. We also had people to perish in my community and the area, in the Nashville area. And if you live in this community, you can help by staying in contact with our government. Now, you can go to this website, go to tn.gov/TEMA. That's tn.gov/TEMA. If you go to this website, you will be able to find out what's happening in the recovery efforts. If you have some information that you need to provide, or if you want to assist in some way, this is the fastest and the quickest way to do that. If you want to donate, also, there are websites, there are Facebook pages that are set up so that you can donate, so the recovery efforts can go on even for months, if not, who knows how long this is going to take. It could take months, it could take weeks, who knows. Right now, at the top of the concerns are the elderly and, of course, children that are missing. I know people are worried about their pets, but I'm worried about people first, and we can, of course, I love animals more than probably most people would think. I've always loved animals and always had pets. But right now we are trying to help people and get them back to their families and get them back in connection with their loved ones and their relations in the community. Now, of course, we also know that the coronavirus situation, I think it's all a hoax. I don't think it's a hoax for the virus. I think that the hoax is what the media is putting out there, and they're scaring people. Look, people, just use common sense. If you're sick, stay at home. Do not cough on someone. Wash your hands frequently. That's the same thing they tell us all the time when you're talking about people with illnesses. If you're sick, stay at home. Don't go to work. Don't go out in the public. Don't do what some of these Democrats are suggesting. Some Democratic moron suggested that people who may be sick with the coronavirus, they should go to a Trump rally. There are people out there suggesting this. This is insane. We have an obligation to protect our communities in any way we can beyond the politics. I'm a Trump supporter. If you ain't figured that out yet, you're not looking or listening to my post or looking at this show. I am a Trump supporter. I think Donald Trump has done a great job. Has he been perfect? No. Nobody's perfect. No one is perfect. But of course, I'm going to remind you again, go to tn.gov/TEMA to find out more information about the recovery efforts. There are still many people without power. I helped an elderly friend yesterday to get his generator started in his home so that he could have electricity in his home. And so if you know of someone that you can help, there's something you can do, please go do it. And be a good citizen, and don't worry about the politics. Let the politics take care of itself. Of course, we have another special guest. He's been on the show before. He's a constitutional expert. And I want to talk today about our rights under the law. I hear people all the time talking about my rights. I have a right. Do you have a right to government mandated insurance? Do you have a right that the government makes you buy something you don't want? Is that a right? Is that a privilege? Do you have a right to someone else's resources? Do you have a right to free health care? Do you have a right to free education? There is no such thing as having those rights under the Constitution. So we need to address those issues, and I have no better to ask these questions and to have on my show today than Hal Rounds. And I want to welcome Hal Rounds to the show. Welcome to the show, Hal. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, sir. How are you today?
I am doing fantastic. Of course, all this is going on right now in our government. What's going on right now with the virus? What's going on in the communities? Was your community affected by the tornadoes or the storms?
No, well, we're in West Tennessee, so we slept through it and didn't hear anything special, actually. Okay.
Of course, being a Tennessean, a fellow Tennessean, you people have out in the West, y'all have y'all's times to have y'all storms as well. And we try to come to the aid of all in our state and in our communities. So, of course, we thank God that your community wasn't affected. Unfortunately, Middle Tennessee was hit really, really hard. Nashville, of course, Lebanon, places like Mount Juliet, Cookeville, Putnam County, all those counties were hit really, really hard with this storm. And I'm hearing that President Trump is going to be coming to Tennessee Friday. So we're looking forward to inviting the president to our state. And of course, I know you do as well. First of all, what is a right? What is a right when it comes to my personal rights? And then what is a right under the Constitution? Give us a broad answer, and then we'll talk about more specific.
Sure, and it's an interesting area, and there's all kinds of convolutions into it. What I like to do is to separate rights into classes. The first class, the one that is found in the Declaration of Independence, is natural rights. These are ones, as it says, endowed by our Creator, and they attend to things like, as it says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're very broad, and we can get into the details on some of the ways people view that in a little bit. But the other class of rights I like to identify are contractual rights. And this is a different class. It is something that you have a right to by virtue of having made some agreement with someone that is mutually binding. All right, and those are a little different than natural rights. The Constitution actually looks at both kinds of rights, and we can get into that. But the two classes are natural and contractual rights.
Okay, when you say natural, give me an example of what would be a natural right in my understanding of it, and then maybe talk about that in terms of when I say my rights to a free education or my rights to, keep and bear arms. How would I compare the two, and what would my natural right be?
Okay, your natural rights are the kinds of things that by virtue of how you are constructed and what it takes to live, that you have a right to access on your own behalf, okay? For instance, the right to breathe, the right to eat, and then you have to look at, well, how do I accomplish those things? The right to eat requires you to have the right to either harvest food that you've grown yourself or to access it through a market and choose what it is you're going to be eating. Those kinds of things are natural. it was really interesting during the period when the Constitution was being considered. After it came out of the Constitutional Convention, each of the 13 states looked at it and decided, okay, well, what are the important things here? And a lot of people said, well, this Constitution is creating a government that is way too powerful. We have to have more restraints on it in order to protect our rights. And they were talking about natural rights in most of that sense. That is why the Bill of Rights was drafted. And the first things that you see in the Bill of Rights, like the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and then to the Second Amendment, the freedom to keep and bear arms, all have to do with how you conduct your affairs and protect yourself and involve yourself in self-governing. Those are natural rights. Okay.
All right.
If you get further along, like particularly in things like the right of the Fifth Amendment or in the Fourth Amendment. Well, the Fourth Amendment really is the right to be free from intrusions by other people who are working for the government in searches and seizures and that sort of thing. The Fifth Amendment begins to look at your right in trials, and it is more of a contractual right where you agree to participate in this society, but you demand that before something can be taken from you by the society, you have the right to due process, for instance. Excuse me. So there's a mix of these things. When we're dealing with other people, you have the rights that are natural, and then by agreement with others, you have rights that are basically contractual.
Okay.
And for instance, if I'm going to go out and take care of my natural right to sustain myself by eating,
mm-hmm.
I then have the power to engage in contractual rights by telling somebody that I will buy this loaf of bread by agreeing to pay you, $1.95. That's not stated in the transaction when you go to the grocery store, but it's an underlying agreement we have as a society. But like, for instance, if somebody's going to say, you don't have the right to carry a gun, well, the Constitution recognizes that, first of all, if you look at how the Second Amendment is worded, you'll notice that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Right.
Well, that doesn't say we're giving you the right to keep and bear arms. They're talking about it as a right that already exists. It's one of the natural rights.
A natural, inalienable right.
Yes, sir. And you use that right to protect yourself against hazards like, like an elephant storming across your lawn at you, or somebody stealing something that you need to survive,
right?
Or attacking you. Those things you have the right to invoke force in order to protect your right to life and liberty. Right?
So does the government, let me stop you for a second because
sure.
I want to interject something. Does the government then, in essence, have a right to force us to do something because it's for our own good, for instance? Say the government says, well, health care is something for your good, so the government then in turn forces you to have health care. How does that infringe upon a right? Well,
let me speak like the libertarian that I used to most purely be. No, your right to life and liberty means you get to choose health care or avoid health care.
Right.
Now, you have the consequence that nature is going to inflict on you if you don't make some choice with regard to health care. But that's not the government. That is natural, and you have to make those decisions yourself. When the government comes in and says, okay, you've got to have health care, then they're going to start defining what elements health care has. They can't have the rule you have to have it without saying what it is.
Right.
Right?
Well, they call
and
it,
that eliminates your choice.
I think they get around it by calling it a tax, that they're taxing us in terms of forcing us to purchase something that we say we don't want. Well, some of us don't want. And by getting around that, of course, the Supreme Court agreed with the Congress in terms of it being called a tax. Now, that's one element. That is one element. Now, that's sort of just my question on that regard. And, of course, if you're out there, if you're listening, and if you're on Facebook or if you got a question, post it in my Facebook page, and I'll try to get that question on to Hal. And we're talking about rights under the Constitution. What are rights, and what are those rights under our law, and what is a God-given right or an inalienable right and a natural right versus something we call a right. Many times people call something, it says it's my right, but they don't define that right, and sometimes it's not constitutional. Am I correct?
Yeah, and that's when you were first introducing the subject, and you mentioned one right that just annoys me to heck. I'll use a nice word.
Okay.
Was the right to a free education. Now, rights are, in this sense, in the constitutional sense, a right is something that somebody cannot restrain you from making a choice on. Okay? Whether it's a contractual right by joining the society or by doing a business deal, you have chosen to accept that right in exchange for something you're obligated to do. All right? In a natural right, that's, again, a choice you are free to make based on your own interpretation of how best to solve a life-related problem. The kind of right that is fabricated out of that is the right to access something that somebody else has to provide. For instance, the right to a free education. And when I'm giving my Constitution classes, it's interesting. I stumbled upon a book in one of those school supply stores that it's a very short booklet, more like a pamphlet, and it's for young kids, like second graders, and it talks about the Constitution giving you rights, and that one of the rights is a free education. And that is so wrong. If you look at anything that has to be provided to you, that has to be provided, something that you don't do for yourself, somebody has to do that. Now, there's only two ways to do it. One is to take it, and the other is to agree to pay for it, to make an exchange. The right to education is you have the right to go and find some way to be educated. If you want to go to public schools, that right is balanced by your paying taxes.
Yes.
Okay? If it's a private school, then you pay directly for it. Now, when somebody says free, that means there is no pay involved. So a free education would be one where the teachers do it for nothing.
Correct.
And if they're getting paid, then it's not a free education. So the question is not so much whether it's going to be paid for, but who's making the payments. When they talk about a free education, what they're telling you is you have a right to tap somebody else for the payment that
exactly.
it costs. And that's slavery. If they're working for a living and part of that's taken away from them to be given to you, even if it's mutual through government, through Bernie's approach to free education, somebody is paying for it, and they're not getting what they have earned in life because they've been taxed.
Well, that's not, and I agree with you because, in essence, if it says free, then there's no exchange for the services or the goods.
Right.
Whether that be if I, pay for your education, but I never expect anything in return, or I never offer anything for compensation of that, then of course, then that's my own will. That's my free will, correct? I'm just doing that of my own will. But if the government says, look, we're going to pay for XYZ's education, but in essence, we're going to raise your taxes to do so. That's not free. Matter of fact, I think it's in some cases it's theft. It's you're robbing one person to satisfy the needs of another person, maybe against that first person's will. So yes, free education is not free. As you said, the teachers are compensated, the administrators are compensated, those who work in the facilities are compensated. So someone is paying, but in many cases they have no say or no choice in the matter other than for the good of the people, which now we're getting into constitutional issues because Bernie Sanders and even some of the moderates on the Democratic side are saying, look, we're gonna force you to pay for these services, especially when it concerns issues of health care, education, and even and if you want to talk about some concerning people being vaccinated for these diseases. How does that interfere with my rights? If the government says, look, there's a coronavirus out here killing people, so we're going to force all of our citizens to be vaccinated. Is that a right, or is that for the greater good?
Well, it may be intended for the greater good, but, people have a right to evaluate things that are going to be penetrating their choice, sovereignty, whatever you'd call it. Just in regard to vaccinations, I had a doctor who was about to make a trip overseas, and he got a shot for yellow fever, and within 3 days he was dead of yellow fever because the inoculation relies on the actual impaired but still alive cells of whatever the disease is. If you ever look back to when our founding era happened, I think it was John Adams whose family was being inoculated against the smallpox. I think it was.
Yes, smallpox.
And the way they inoculated back then is they took somebody who had survived smallpox and they scraped off a little bit of the scab, and they rubbed it on your skin or into a incision that they'd made, very, very small,
right,
so that your body would create antibodies against this infusion. And sometimes it would cause the smallpox. So is it unreasonable for somebody to say, I think I'll take my chance with being exposed to the flu or the coronavirus?
Right.
Now, on the other hand, other people have the right to avoid you when you've made a choice that doesn't seem sensible to them.
Correct.
So if you're going to have your kid going to a school, let's say, and you know that one of the other kids is refusing to get vaccinated when there's a threat, then you have the right to say, you know what, let's go to the school and say that kid's got to stay out until this crisis is passed. So everybody has these rights to protect themselves, and they work through the society to make agreements to do it.
Well, and of course the government does have a role to play in our safety. And of course that gets into the issue of the border, or what's, being allowed to come, and I can maybe, if you let me give an example, I would give an example of, being able to travel by, on an airplane. Does the airline have a right to ask me if I've been given all of my shots for certain things? Do they have a right to ask me where I'm going and when am I coming back? Does the government have a right to those to ask those questions? Why? Because yes, I could be going somewhere that I may bring back a disease that affects others on the plane. Correct? So
yeah. And the thing is, a lot of the things you have a right to do, like asking somebody where they're going or whether they've been inoculated, you have the right to ask that question, or they do, and you have the right, when asked that question, to
refuse to answer. Yes.
Now, if the term of the question is, you don't get to fly on my airplane if you don't answer my question, then you have made a contractual agreement. I'm going to answer that question in return for your obligation then to fly me if I pay for my fare and so on.
Yes.
But you have the right to do things that other people don't have to cooperate with.
Correct. And I think that's where the confusion is coming in, because then all of a sudden I sue the airline because I'm saying my rights were violated. No, your rights are not violated. You're just not agreeing to the terms that they are asking you to agree with. You don't have to fly that airline. Go find someone that's not asking the question. So that gets that gets into another level of this for me that maybe, I don't know if someone else has questions about it. They're talking about on the Facebook, people are saying, Ruby Ruffin says it sounds like a communism move when the government is maybe coming in and forcing us to do certain things against our will. She says it sounds like a communism move. And, you know, it's a very delicate line here that we're talking about, because we don't want to impose our rights on to others and endanger theirs as well. So it gets a little bit tricky in terms of when we fly or when we go to school or when we go to work. You know, my employer or myself as an employer, I have a right to set standards for my environment in my workplace. So look, if I notice that you're like you're doing, if I notice you're coughing, I have a right to ask you, did you have your flu shot?
Well, I didn't, but it's a cough because I swallowed wrong.
Right. Well, I'm just saying, you know, I have a right to do that. Now, of course, as an employee, you don't have to answer that question. You have a right to remain silent. But I also have a right to protect my employees and ask you, you know, I need you to go to the infirmary. I need you to go see the nurse. Or, you know, will you do that so that we can make sure that no germs or whatnot are being spread amongst other workers, because we do have an obligation for their safety. So, yes, we get into that tricky little gray area. Of course, we got Hal Rounds on today. He's my special guest for this hour. This is our first hour-long episode of I May Be Wrong, but I don't think so. I see that others are in the chat room that are, on the Facebook. And if you have a comment, you have a question, please do so. Post it in Facebook and I will get it to my friend Hal. Of course, he is talking to us today about our rights under the law. And of course, I've given examples and he's given and sharing it and his example and his expertise on this matter. And we've talked about it before, and you're talking about it now, about free education. Let's talk about what the promises that are being made by the present, the candidates that are left. Now, of course, they're dropping out like flies now. I think Bloomberg has dropped out. You know, that's a proof. Bloomberg has just proved that money does not buy you intelligence. That's what he just proved. He spent almost $500,000 to turn and then now support the candidate. Of course, not Bernie Sanders, but Uncle Joe, Uncle Joe Biden. He's going to support. He's putting his support behind Joe Biden. Global Char has stepped out. She's putting her support behind Joe Biden. Of course, Buttigieg, he's doing the same. And now we have probably left Warren. Now, if Warren drops out, that's going to make it very interesting because I think her vote is going to split. Let me ask you this. The candidates that are running, of course, we're going to go into another 30 minutes of this, so take your time. The candidates that are running now that are making these promises, what obligation do they have to inform the citizens of what their rights are and what they're asking for? Do they have any obligation whatsoever to do that?
Morally, yeah. When it gets into political promises, there's an awful lot of leeway in strangling or twisting the truth. I look at the Democratic listing as primarily the B team. There was Biden and Buttigieg and Bloomberg and and Bernie.
Yes.
So that's the B team, and it's getting thinner. But they make all these promises, and then they don't show how they're going to accomplish it in a real world, or how it's going to impact the people and their freedoms of choice. It seems like there's an awful lot of people in America these days that are willing to give up rights for certain kinds of protection. And that goes back even to our founding era.
Yes.
When the colonies were getting more and more disobedient to England, there was a man named Samuel Johnson who said, the exact words I don't have, but it's, he who accepts protection stipulates obedience. And that really makes sense. You cannot protect somebody or provide them with something that they need without them being under your control. You can't
Correct.
protect a child from running into the street unless you have the power to stop him. And
restrain that child if necessary.
Yeah. And when you look at, well, we're going to protect you with health care, then you have to say, well, how can they protect me if I choose to smoke cigarettes? How can they protect me if I
choose to
don't want to go to the doctor? You know,
Yeah.
So in order to protect me, they also have to say what I am going to do. And all of a sudden, you're not free anymore.
Exactly. So when Bernie says we're going to give you free health care because it's a right, what he's not finishing the conversation with is how am I going to make you obey what I call free? How am I going to control you in order to ensure that what I'm doing is for your own good? And if you don't obey me, then what's going to be the consequences? Well, we already know the consequences with the Obamacare was the mandates with the penalties. They were going to penalize you financially if you did not abide by his mandates. Now, what is Bernie going to do if we don't abide by his free health care, free education program? I don't know. Can you maybe enlighten my audience on what the possibilities are when someone, just as you just stated, if they provide you protection and you accept that protection, you are also under their controls in some regards. Am I correct?
Yes, sir. I don't know just how Bernie or the others propose to enforce you being healthy. You know, there's going to be certain programs they do and certain that they don't. And like the Obamacare plan, the way they were going to enforce you getting health insurance, which is just one phase of health care, was by, and this was invented by Roberts, not by the Democrats. The guy on the Supreme Court
who's
said,
a conservative.
well, we're going to say it's a tax. If you read Obamacare, I didn't read the whole thing, but I read, introductory parts of it actually on the statute.
Yes.
And it was proposed as a law as being referring to the authority in the Constitution of Congress to regulate commerce. That was a failed foundation for Obamacare, and for the Supreme Court to have then said, well, no, it's not a commerce thing, but it's a tax, and you can tax somebody, and there's no definition of what you can tax. And that is true. There's no definition of what you can tax. But to change the way the law was founded is a legislative choice that the Supreme Court really had no authority to make.
Right. And, of course, we are talking today with Hal Rounds, a constitutional attorney. And also, I want to remind you that we have a situation in our state. We had tornadoes that have recently affected so many of our citizens. If you would like to help, you can go to tn.gov/TEMA. That's tn.gov/TEMA and get the information there about the recovery efforts. You can also find out about the coronavirus and all the other things that are affecting us as citizens. And we're talking about these issues at the moment concerning our rights under the Constitution and what that is in terms of the rights of the citizens to keep and bear arms, our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and how these promises that Bernie and people like Elizabeth Warren and others who are making all these outlandish promises to our young people, and they're just falling for it. You know, the young people are voting for Bernie Sanders. That's what concerns me about this issue coming up with the election. You know, how this is going to affect, the coming generations if they're willing now to give up that freedom for free health care, free food, free education, free transportation. At what point are you now a slave?
Boy, that's a good question, isn't it? It's a phasing into slavery, that's for sure. And one of the things, I was on the text advisory panel in Tennessee, and I've read a lot of textbooks, and I've seen how our history and economics and civics are being presented to the kids. And these textbooks and some of the issues that I looked at in the really are propagandistic against capitalism and socialism. And a lot of the choices that the kids, and I'm calling them kids, these youngsters are making are based on faulty education that's coming out of the public school system. And it's not just the public school system, it's the textbooks that are shared by private schools. They just don't understand what they're giving up or what we had in the first place. That's another whole topic. In fighting for our rights, they've been indoctrinated that rights are something that somebody owes you, rather than the freedom to make a choice and access it on your own effort.
And you just brought up something. The rights that someone gave you is when someone gives you something, then in many cases they expect something in return. So how does that conflict, how do we overcome this conflict with how our children are being educated or indoctrinated with these so-called rights that they perceive they have that someone else is promising them? How are we going to address this issue, especially when it comes to the fact that many of these people can vote? They have the right to vote. In some cases, they're wanting to lower that stage that you can vote as far as your age, and of course, maybe even your mental capacity. Some of these people that are being allowed or given this opportunity to vote are former felons who have not either come back to society, they're still incarcerated. Some of them are being allowed to vote in some of the elections. At what point is the average citizen going to say, wait a minute, how are their rights to do this affecting me, and what can I do about it?
I think you're touching the biggest practical factor in our problems today. The education of people as to what a right is, the education as to what our history has been, the education as to what makes a marketplace work, all these things are so distorted and so thoroughly indoctrinated by the academic establishment. We've got a real problem with it.
Well, and I'm going to get some comments in. I see that Paula is in the chat room. She says propaganda, to be sure. She says mind control. Couple that with television programming, and you have intervention. Of course, we are at that place to where technology has allowed us to communicate in ways that we couldn't even imagine 30 years ago, let alone how that's affecting our educational system. We now have a time to where even with the benefits that we do have with technology, many times it's being misused to use as propaganda against us. We're now at a time to where the government is intruding in our elections, where they try to a duly elected president, they try to impeach with no grounds. They really had no grounds to impeach President Trump, but they tried to remove a president who was duly elected by the citizens. Address that. What are my rights as an American to not only address this issue with our government, but how do we do that? You know, some people will say, well, you just need to vote them out. That's not always easy when you talk about the House of Representatives. Am I correct? You know, how, address that for the listeners, Hal.
Well, see, that's a problem. When you had talked about Trump being duly elected,
yes,
and how ridiculous it was to try to impeach him, and then we turn around and say, okay, now how do we get rid of people who are real idiot representatives?
Correct.
And the answer is yes, we have to vote. But in order to vote, in order to fix how the voting is based on such idiocy, we have to actually stand up, educate ourselves, and go to school board meetings. We have to go and interview our representatives. We have to. Freedom takes work.
Yes, it's
and
not free.
And we have been the beneficiaries of work that was done by 2 centuries of people ahead of us, and they were working hard at it. And now here we are, enjoying what we've been given and not doing the work necessary to pass it on to our kids. You have to get up and go do it.
You have to not just vote, which is important. You have to be an informed voter. You need, like you just said, you need to educate yourself. I had someone recently, I'd just like to share a quick story about the early voting. A lot of people early vote, especially in the primaries. They want to get their vote. But in many cases, especially with the Democrats, many of those people who early voted, their votes were null and void in regards of who they voted for, because many of them have now dropped out. So, yes, we do need to vote, but you need to be an informed voter. You need to know what these people plan to do once they're in office. And that's what I think is the biggest issue, because the Democrats have a leg up, especially in education, because many of them are liberal already. Many of them have control of our children to a degree for a certain number of hours per day. Many of them set the policies when it comes to how our children are going to be educated. So if the average citizen is not informed, no matter what they do in the voting booth, their children are still being encouraged to go along with these socialist, communist, Marxist ideologies that ultimately is going to undermine their very freedom.
Yep. And for people who have kids in school or grandkids, what I would recommend is that they get a hold of the primarily social studies textbooks that they have,
right,
or other signs of what's going on in the curriculum. And if they see something goofy, inform themselves as to what it should be, and go to the school board and say, why are you teaching my kid this?
Right. Yeah. Go ask questions, or go and say, or at least be willing to go to the meetings. And that's, when you hear about the school board, many people never know the meetings, where they are, who's going to be over them, and they just let things just go until they just get out of hand. Is what eventually happens. Now, of course, I do have family members that are in education. I have people who are family members who are also in law enforcement and also in our military, and I highly respect all of them for what they do. But at the same time, these people are being paid for. Their jobs are paid for by the taxpayers. And the taxpayers ultimately have a right to ask questions and make demands on what their resources are being used for. Now, of course, as a constitutional conservative, this is why I love having you on the show, because I get to ask questions, and also my audience also gets to be involved in getting information that they may need. Of course, we got about 10 more minutes to go. But let me ask you, Hal, And of course, we've talked about the rights, the God-given rights, the rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the rights of the government to, of course, to address certain issues. Sanctuary cities, especially with this thing coming up with the coronavirus. Sanctuary cities. What obligations do the leaders in our government have to their citizens when it comes to sanctuary cities and allowing people to come there and not addressing the needs of the citizens? Is that something the American people have a right to expect their government to do?
Well, when we agreed to live under the Constitution, there were certain elements that were left to states to do on their own.
Okay.
And we need to always protect that aspect of federalism. When you look at immigration, if you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9 pointed out that the power to control immigration remained in the states until 1808. So that was a 20-year period when the states had a pure control. Then the federal government after that point was empowered to prohibit importation or immigration. And that was primarily focused on the slave question, but it also dealt with anybody coming into the country. From 1808 on, it was a federal authority as well as a state authority. Now, when we flash forward to today, the federal government has increased its power on that and is basically the gatekeeper for the national borders and for what's going to come in and what rules they have to follow to join us, whether as visitors or as fellow citizens.
Correct.
Now, given that authority being federal, it is a very difficult thing because you don't want to stifle the state's remaining self-sovereignty.
Correct.
But on the other hand, you have to protect the whole nation. Now, if somebody's going to let an alien, an illegal, come into Oakland, California, and say, okay, you can commit this crime and we might punish you for your robbery, but we're going to hide you from the federal government because you're an illegal. Then they go to the adjoining community, which is not a sanctuary, and commit a crime there. So these sanctuaries are, I would say, and you know, as an attorney, I would have to look for the grounds and defining the crime. But I have recommended that in Fayette County here, that if Shelby County, our next door neighbor, is going to be a shelter for people who are illegal, and then those illegal people come to Fayette County and cause harm, that Fayette County has the obligation to protect our citizens, and that by doing so, they have the right, administratively, to sue the people who have illegally harbored the illegal.
Right.
So I'm looking for some crime to happen in Fayette County where we can go ahead and sue Shelby.
Well, you know, and that's happening in my own community where we're having to put up certain types of protections because many people in Davidson County, criminals, are coming into Wilson County to commit their crimes. But if Davidson County is going to protect that individual and not hand them over to ICE or not hand them over to federal government, I think that's going to open a door to where these lawsuits are going to start happening so that these county officials in their local communities are held accountable for those poor decisions that they're making that are affecting other people. So that gets back to also, you know, my rights as an individual to protect myself, to protect my family, to make decisions for myself and my family. And those rights should not be infringed because why? I was given these rights not by government, but by God Almighty. And I think that's something a lot of people just tend to overlook because they think it's expedient to get something from the government. You know, they don't want to save their money for their child's education. They don't want to purchase their own home. They don't want to invest in their own careers. So, in essence, they are willing to give up their right in order for the government to provide those for them. But what they're not realizing is, in essence, they have willfully become a slave. They have willfully become a slave. Of course, we got about 5 more minutes. And Hal, I want you to tell people, one, how can they get in? How can my audience, if they want to get in contact with you, they want to ask more questions about the Constitution, of course, they can do so through me, through the show. But how can they do so if they would like to do on their own?
Okay. I have a Facebook page which isn't very active. It's just halrounds.com. I do have a small column that I write in the Fayette County newspaper, the Fayette Falcon, and I have that posted on that each week.
Okay.
There's some weeks I don't do it, but I would prefer from your audience if they would contact me through you.
Okay, great.
If you don't mind.
I don't mind at all. I love having you on the show. I know that I can get you to come on and talk about these issues, and they're broad issues. This is why I wanted an hour show about this, because it's hard to talk about this issue in just 30 minutes. Actually, we need more time than this. But yes, they can contact me through my Facebook page, my website, of course, at I may be wrong, but I don't think so.com. You can contact me as well through Facebook at Al Ashworth. You can also look up me on Facebook at I may be wrong, but I don't think so. That way you can contact me if you got questions for Hal, if it's questions that you would like to expound upon and you want to contact Hal, I will get you in touch with Hal Rounds. He is definitely the expert that I appreciate and someone that I like to come on the show because, one, he's not – Hal, I will say, I understand that your political position, but, of course, our first obligation as citizens is to protect the Constitution so that everyone is treated equally under the law. When people make special rights, gay marriage or whatnot, or some of these other things, I think that we are really tampering with the Constitution. And I'm going to give you the final thoughts on this. Go ahead and finish your thoughts on what you say are God-given rights versus the rights under the law.
Okay. Before I do that, I would like to say I offer a full-day Constitution seminar to people, which I call the Constitution Refresher. And if anybody has a group of people anywhere in the state of Tennessee that would like to have me there it was usually on a Saturday, and go through a 5-hour session that's fun, go ahead and contact Al, and I would be anxious to go and do that. I have one tentatively scheduled up in it's up near Cookville.
Okay.
In August, but I have others that I'm doing. Anyway, now you were also asking me to talk about the basic things on rights.
Yes.
God-given rights are not are inalienable. You always have that right, but you can forfeit exercise of that right by doing things that harm other people, or by just neglecting to protect the right yourself. Your right to life, for instance, is natural and it's inalienable. But if you don't defend yourself, you can lose it.
Right.
That's one of the kinds of things. The other kind of right that I stressed was that the contractual right, where you have a right to expect somebody to give you something if you have a contractual relationship with that person, which involves you also being obligated to give them something.
Basically, exchanging goods and services. And in many cases, under a capitalism, that involves some type of currency of some sort, whether that's hard currency or whether that's some type of exchange of services. So, yes. And so, yeah, I think that, to me, it makes it more clear as a citizen, as an American citizen, especially when those that are promising me free cannot promise me free without putting me in some type of bondage. I think Americans need to be aware of that. They need to wake up to this. Free means bondage in terms of what the government is offering. So, of course.
Well, there's a thing, I don't remember the exact wording, but the pigs enjoy going to the trough, but they don't know why the food is free.
Right. Well, that's a great way to end this conversation for us today. Hal, I really want to thank you for coming on, talking about this issue. Of course, I'm glad that you were not affected by the tornadoes that we recently had in the state, but keep us in our prayers, and we'll have you back on at another date to talk about more constitutional issues.
Thank you, sir.
God bless you, sir.
God bless you.
Of course, he's a constitutional expert. He's been on many times on the show since I started the broadcast, and I really appreciate him coming on. And I want to thank you in the chat room. I see that we have those in the chat room. I see Daryl Graham has joined us there. What's up, brother? I see that you're in the chat room. Paula McLenany is in the chat room. She says, for all the sake of votes, what a crying shame. That's right. All for the sake of votes. They're promising free health care, free food, free education, free whatever, free transportation. They're offering all these freedoms in exchange for something you already were given the God-given right to do, and that is vote. You should not be willing to exchange your vote for somebody promising you something that you already have a right to. The government has no right to take things away from you unless you're willing to give it to them. Unless you're willing to give up those rights or not defend those rights, then that's where the problem comes in. Daryl says they fatten them up for the slaughterhouse. Exactly. He's talking about the pigs. They fatten you up. They're getting you all good and fat. The black community has been getting good and fat with the Democrats for years. Look what just recently happened in South Carolina. I'm not going to go over the whole issue, but what just happened in South Carolina, that pumped new life into Joe Biden. Joe Biden reminded me of John McCain. John McCain was pretty much dead in the water until the Democrats pumped life into him. The media pumped life into him. Joe Biden is not fitted to be president of the United States. He has questions to answer when it comes to what happened with his son, Joe Jr., whatever his name is, Hunter Biden. When he can answer questions about Hunter Biden, what happened in the Ukraine, he's going to be asked those questions when it comes time. And I think the American people have a right to know if he was in the Ukraine quid pro quo and giving favors to the Ukrainians in regards to help his son get that money. And then they want to try to put that over onto President Trump and try to impeach him over a phone call. Of course, we have a lot of things happening. I want to remind you that you can help if you go to tn.gov/TEMA. If you're not a Tennessean or if you are a Tennessean, if you just want to help the efforts with the tornado recovery, it was devastating. The tornado was nearly a half a mile wide. Nearly a half a mile wide. It was coming in some places, and it was just skipping and jumping from one place to another. And people, so far, there are many people still missing. So far in one county, there are 88 people missing, and they have no idea what has happened other than they have not been able to, unable to, or they just don't know that people are looking for them. But this is a small knit community, and I think that many of these people are still missing due to that tornado. So 88 people, 25 people plus have died. More have died in Tennessee from that tornado than all of the country have died from the coronavirus. Remember that. Remember that you're being told that this coronavirus is a pandemic, that it's an emergency. Yes, but there are more babies dying from abortion every day. I always put up this abortion clock, and if you hadn't seen this clock, it's 62,084,000, but it's still clocking, it's still counting every day. Abortions, babies, every 30 seconds, a baby is being murdered in his mother's womb. Of course, I want to thank you for being a part of the show today. Of course, Ashworth, and I want to say God bless you, God bless America, and peace.
You've been listening to Alfonso Ashworth, the Barry White of Podcast Radio. Go forth and share his message. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. Remember, no two people can ever occupy the same place at the same time. You were uniquely and wonderfully made. Born an original. Don't die a copy. God bless. Peace.